Yeah, a dog wagging its tail. So what happens to its forward portion of the body when the tail turns to right? A dog wagging its tail, right? So this is a dog wagging its tail. So when the tail wags to right, the tendency of the body is to move the opposite direction, right? And that happens to the dog continuously. That's why dogs do this when they wag the tail, right? So even though there is actually a change in airflow here, it is signaled to the front. That's because there's a connection. And similarly, the same thing is, don't really get confused with what I'm telling right now. I did not tell you before because I didn't want to confuse you, but let me just put that through and see if you can understand. When this sheet of air is actually bending down, and why is it bending down? Because of this downward nature of the vortices. When it is kind of bending down, that bending is kind of signaled ahead because it's a continuous sheet of air. It's connected through molecules, right? And therefore, that signaling causes the sheet to actually bend upward. As well. So as the sheet behind goes down, the sheet above goes up. So that it gets signaled ahead of the aircraft, just like a dog wagging its tail. So as the dog wags its tail, the forward part of the dog is going to move in the opposite direction. Same way, as the sheet of air gets bent down, why is it bending down? Because of the vortices affecting it and the eddies affecting it, which is what is called as downwash. This downward flow is what is called as the downwash. We can explain this with respect to Coanda effect, Newton's law of motion, etc., which adds to it. But the downwash kind of increases the kind of lifts up the sheet of air. Now you see for the wing, the relative airflow is coming. The airflow is coming from this direction, right? Now you look at this wing from the side. That is what I've drawn here. So you can see initially there's a sheet of air, and now the front part of the sheet, it rose up. Now the relative air, so the airflow is coming from a higher direction, from an upward direction for this particular wing, for the same wing. Understood? See the same thing here. This is the relative airflow, which is here. Now there's an elevation here. That is the other airflow, which we term as the effective airflow. What direction is the aircraft moving? This does not affect the movement of the aircraft. The aircraft is still moving in this direction. The aircraft is still moving in this direction, but what is the direction of the airflow? Is it exactly opposite to the aircraft? No. It is not exactly opposite to the aircraft. If it was exactly opposite to the aircraft should have moved in this direction, exactly opposite. The airflow, say I am moving like this, the airflow is coming from, just like you drive when it's raining. The rain is coming from inclined nature. That is against the normal property of a relative airflow. So an airflow can be a relative airflow only if the direction of the relative airflow is exactly opposite to the direction of the aircraft. But here the airflow is in this direction, the aircraft is in that direction, and that's not exactly opposite, it's inclined. And therefore we call it as the effective airflow because it does not obey the basic properties of a relative airflow. Did you understand? Right? Now you see the initial angle of attack here between relative airflow and the chord line. Because of this downwash and this sheet of air lifting up, what happened to the angle of attack? Reduced. Now think about it. Let's go back to what we revised today, the first part of it. Your angle of attack reduced. You are trying to maintain your lift. I don't want to climb and descend, right? So as the angle of attack reduces, to maintain lift, what should I do? Increase your speed. So the angle of attack is reduced, and that to compensate that, the only way is to actually increase your speed. The velocity increases. Now, is that clear? And from where do you get this? This is from basically from the basic lift equation. Is equal to CL QS, and Q has this rho v square and CL has the alpha. So if I want to maintain lift for a decreasing angle of attack, I have to increase my velocity, right? Now when you increase the velocity, what is increasing? Your dynamic pressure is increasing, therefore you can maintain your lift, right? But as the dynamic pressure increases, what else will increase? So what other parameter also has the same Q in it? That's it, drag. So what is drag equation? Coefficient of drag Qs. So as Q increases, why is Q increasing? Because V is increasing. And why is it increased? I want to maintain lift for a reducing angle of attack. So what happens to drag here for an increasing dynamic pressure? Drag increases. This drag, increase in drag, is because of what? Is because of you trying to maintain your lift, for which you increased your velocity. Why? Because your angle of attack reduced. Therefore, you had to increase your velocity to maintain lift, and that caused an increase in dynamic pressure. So even though that has maintained the lift, it has increased the drag. This increase in drag is what we call as the induced. That's an induced drag. So this drag is called as an induced drag because it is induced because of lift, or you trying to maintain the lift at least, right? Therefore, it's also called as lift induced drag, LID, lift induced drag. So that is the second type of drag. So first is the parasitic drag, which consists of skin friction, form or pressure and interference. The second type is the lift induced drag. Right? So generally, if you look at the textbooks or general classes, what they generally say is that the wingtip vortices reduces the effective lift, and since the effective lift reduces, that reduction in effective lift is because of induced drag. Is it clear now? All the way till here, right? Think about it. When you have the wingtip vortices and the eddies kind of increasing the downwash, the relative airflow changes and it becomes more like an effective airflow, and this effective airflow reduces the angle of attack because the chord line is the same, and this reduction angle of attack will kind of demand a higher velocity if you want to maintain your lift. The increased velocity will increase dynamic pressure, which will increase the drag, and that additional drag that is produced because of this lift is what is called as lift induced drag. Now come back to this figure again. Now imagine that this particular equivalent airflow was not there. We are talking about relative airflow. How will you draw the lift vector? The lift vector, how do you draw that? The lift vector is always perpendicular to the relative airflow, right? Lift is perpendicular, drag is opposite, all those things you know. So it is the lift acts from along the chord line, from the center of pressure. Therefore, I'll mark a point here and then I'll mark the lift. Right? The lift is acting all the way here. Now, what happens when your airflow changes its position and becomes an effective airflow from here? Now, how do you think the lift is acting? Again, the lift is now going to act perpendicular to the effective airflow.
Yes.
Right? Effective airflow is nothing but the airflow only. We are calling it different because one is the ideal property, but the other doesn't satisfy the property. After all, it is the airflow only. And the lift is going to act perpendicular to the effective airflow. What do you think will happen to this lift vector? It's going to be perpendicular now to the effective airflow. So, what will happen?
It's going to shift more.
That's it. So, it is going to be like this now. Did you understand? Because now it is perpendicular to equivalent airflow. So it is like this. So what happens to lift? Lift gets inclined rearward. I'm just trying to put some textbook terms here. Lift gets inclined rearward. Do you understand why is it inclining? Because lift is perpendicular to the airflow. Initially the airflow was this one, the corresponding lift is this. Now the airflow is like this, the corresponding lift is this. Right? What here you can see that the lift, since the lift is inclined, so what is lift trying to balance? Weight. Right? What happens when you incline the lift? Now there is one component of lift now acting in the direction of drag, and another component that is acting vertically up. So if I draw this lift here, the lift now has two different components. One component, which is L1, is the only component that is going to balance weight, because weight is going to act directly towards center of the earth. It's not going to change. So this entire lift is not going to balance the weight anymore because the lift got inclined. So the amount of lift that is now available to you to balance your weight reduced. right? And you have one component of lift now in the direction of drag. So you see, the lift which you wanted the airfoil to produce is now acting against you. A component of that is acting against you. Did you understand? What happens to the effect of drag here?
No, it's increased.
It's increased. The L1 is the lift that is going to balance weight, right? It should be L that is balancing weight. Now this is a small component of the L that is balancing, but the other component is now busy kind of feeding the drag because you inclined it, right? So what happens to drag? The drag has increased by an amount L2. Okay, right? That can be also called as a lift induced drag. So it is actually lift inducing a drag because there's now a component of lift acting in the direction of drag. Therefore, this is also the lift induced drag. Now, what is the consequence? Did you understand this? Do you understand why the lift is inclined rearward? Because it is parallel to effective airflow. The moment it inclines rearward, it now gets a component. One acting exactly opposite to the weight, that is this one, and the other acting like this. So what is happening in that direction? What aerodynamic force is happening in that direction? Drag. So the other one is going to be in line with the drag. So the drag increases by an amount L2, remember, which is nothing but part of the lift only, produced by the aerofoil. So that lift itself, a part of the lift is inducing the drag, which is what is called as lift induced drag. And what is the consequence? What happens when drag increases? How can you balance it now?
Excess thrust.
Balanced by thrust. So you need to be very specific, but we have told all these things multiple times. You know, drag balances, the thrust balances drag, right? So as you said, excess thrust is required to balance this L2 part of the drag, which is the lift induced drag. Did you understand why it is called lift induced drag? It is the same lift that is produced by the wing, a component of which is now acting in the direction of drag. That is the worst thing. Something which should be favorable to you is now acting against you, at least a portion of that. So what happens when you increase? How can you increase the thrust? By making your engine work more every given second. So basically that's like more power, more fuel, and that goes from your pocket, right? So by trying to reduce lift induced drag, what are you doing? You're trying to save money. Understood? And how is that done? So why is this happening in the first place? From where did all this thing start? It starts because there's an increased downwash here, and the downward component is introduced by this leakage of the air coming all the way from the top of the wing. So what they did was they understood that by preventing the wingtip vortices from not forming, they can actually reduce this particular lift induced drag. There's a very good documentary in YouTube. Whenever you get time, you can watch that. So initially they did not know what is this excess drag that is there in the aircraft, which they could not really comprehend too. And they did a lot of experiments, and finally they understood that they observed eagle. And if you look eagle flying, you can see what the eagle does. As you know, these eagles, they can hover a lot. No, not hover. What do you call? They can keep the wings still without flapping, and then they can actually fly long distances without flapping their wings. Have you seen that? Eagles kind of scanning for chickens and all stuff. So if you look at those eagles, you can see the wing. If you look at the eagle's wings, the eagle, while it is kind of hovering, kind of does this to the tip of the wing. What the eagle does is, the eagle is preventing any of the air from leaking by creating a deliberate wall there. And when the eagle does this, there is no span-wise flow. There is no air pushing it. There is no air going to the wing root. It's a direct flow. Therefore, there is no eddies formed, no wingtip vortices. And there is no wingtip vortices, and there is no extra downwash. Therefore, there is no lifting up of equivalent airflow. It's more like relative airflow only. No rearward tilting of the lift. No rearward component of lift increasing the drag, and therefore there is no lift induced drag. Even though the eagle doesn't know what it's doing, this is how it does, and this is what's happening. So the eagle now needs to spend less amount of energy to throttle forward. Otherwise, it has to now have more thrust. It has to probably flap more to actually thrust forward and stay without flapping for lesser amount of time. So this is what triggered them, and this is what we have now introduced into the wing. Yes.
The wingtip is helping that you were saying.
Yeah, it's helping by the sharklets or the winglets. It's helping by preventing the wingtip vortices. So when there is no wingtip vortices, there is no downward flow, and when there is no downward flow, the relative airflow is not going to shift up, and therefore the angle of attack is not going to get reduced, and therefore you don't have to increase the velocity. Therefore, drag is not going to increase. Therefore, there is no lift-induced drag. So this is what triggered them to kind of introduce this wingtip into our wings of the aircraft. But as I told you, when you do that, that also increases a parasitic drag because there's an additional surface which you're introducing. But in the long run, it's found that reducing the induced lift-induced drag is going to be very, very fuel efficient. Have you seen? I think it's for 787. They have introduced a foldable wingtip. Have you seen the videos of that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So what they do is when they take off and land, they use the wingtip. They use the wingtip, and when they cruise up, they kind of fold it back. So I'll tell you that why a bit later. But did you understand this? Lift-induced drag. It's not like parasitic drag. It's a lot more going into lift-induced drag here. You really need to understand what that is. It's a drag that is induced because of lift. Whenever there is lift production, you will have drag. What we can do is, even by keeping winglets, we can reduce it. We cannot make it zero. We can reduce the amount of lift-induced drag. But any given lift production will produce induced drag. Clear?
But sir, why all the aircraft doesn't use these things? Wing shark or winglets?
No, they use it. Older aircraft don't use it. The sharklets is an Airbus term for winglets. Airbus calls it as sharklets. It's the same thing, right? You look at multi-engine aircrafts. Even for training aircraft, they have this end plates or winglets. Winglet is one of the structures. There's something called as end plates, tip tanks. Such kind of structures are used at the end of the wings to kind of. Did you already understand why? How is it helping by blocking the wing tip vortices from forming? Right? When you have the wingtip, it acts like a wall and stops that circulation, and you won't have those vortices, and then it continues all the way till here. Perfect? Yeah. So let's look into the questions now. All right, so look at that drag section, and you can see a flow chart that is given that is illustrating the type of drags which we have studied. Look at the box that is given there. You have two different types of drag, parasitic drag and induced drag. Which of these is lift dependent or as a result of lift generation is the induced drag? So it's more appropriately called as a lift induced drag. You can write that term there. You can put a hyphen and write lift induced drag or LID. And parasitic drag is independent of lift generation. Whether or not a surface is generating lift, you will still have parasitic drag. Think about a symmetrical wing with zero angle of attack. Will it produce any lift? It will still produce drag, which is called parasitic drag. It is independent of lift production, but induced drag will be there only when there is a lift being produced.